Do politicians know their history? Well, when it comes to Alexander the Great, the answer seems to be no. Listen to this example. Alexander the Great said the people of Asia were slaves because they could not pronounce the word no. But the government on this occasion must be careful not to display such a lamentable disability. That was without a doubt the world's worst impression of Winston Churchill, speaking in the House of Commons in July 1927. He was speaking against a motion to lower taxes, but there's one massive problem with Churchill's argument. There is no evidence at all that Alexander ever said those words. Churchill has made it up. I've looked at every single time Alexander has been mentioned in the UK Parliament since the year 1800. And in this video, we're going to talk about how history has been used, abused, and misunderstood by politicians. But we're also going to do more than that. I'll be talking about brand new research that I've been doing this week. And instead of just presenting my conclusions, I'm going to take you behind the curtain of historical research and show you how to do a research project of your own. My starting question is, how have modern politicians used Alexander the Great in parliamentary debates in the UK? And to answer that question, I need to introduce you to my evidence. The official record of the UK Parliament is known as Hansard, and you can access it online with records going back to the early 19th century. Hansard is described as a substantially verbatim report of what members of Parliament have said. That means it doesn't report everything word for word, but its aim is to report accurately what has been said in Parliament. That means we can trust Hansard to reflect what has been said in Parliament, and so, with some caveats, it's good evidence for this project. There are different ways that we can use Hansard, but since I'm searching for mentions of Alexander the Great, I'm just going to chuck those 3 words into the keyword search and see what happens. But notice that I'm putting speech marks around the words Alexander the Great. That means that we're going to search for those 3 words as a chain. If you don't do that, you're going to get every single mention of the word Alexander and the word great, and that's going to leave thousands of results that are impossible to analyse. I'm then going to change the date range to cover all of the parliamentary records, and I'm also going to note down this disclaimer at the top that the records for 2004 to 2006 aren't accessible online at the moment. I might need to follow that up separately another time. I'm also going to sort things with the oldest reference first. That's entirely a personal preference, but when it comes to things like parliamentary debates, sometimes a speaker might refer back to something that was said on a previous occasion. So reading through things chronologically lets me see how things develop. So now we've refined our search, you can see that we've got 103 hits, and that is the evidence I'm going to be working with. Now at this point, some people would just start opening up different debates, seeing what was there, reading it, scribbling down anything that they thought was interesting. And I know that's the fun stuff you want to get stuck in, but don't do that. A serious historian needs to have a plan for how they're going to handle their evidence. Otherwise, you're going to end up wasting time in the long term. So let's talk about my plan. When I'm approaching evidence for the first time, I've got a couple of rules. Number 1, I don't want to have to repeat things. We've all done it, read something, not written it down properly, and then weeks later gone, oh, where was that? What was that bit of information? And ended up having to do all of our reading again. I want to avoid that. Number 2, I want to keep track of the evidence in a way that is flexible so I can add to it in the future and I can easily look at it from different angles. The method I use varies depending on the nature of the evidence that I'm working with, but for this project I designed a basic Excel spreadsheet to keep track of the evidence that I was looking at. This is what I started with. The first 5 columns capture the basic data, the year and the specific date, whether Alexander was mentioned in the House of Commons or the House of Lords, the name of the speaker and the topic of the debate. Then we've got 3 columns that deal with the example itself. I'm going to start out by copying in the text of the actual example. Obviously, I'm not going to copy the whole parliamentary debate. I'm just going to pick out the key lines where Alexander is mentioned. Now I'm doing that so that I've always got access to the text. There is nothing worse than having a deadline coming up and finding out that the website you need to access is down for whatever reason. Once I've done that, I'm also going to do a short summary that reminds me of key details from the example. The really key bit is the next column. I'm going to assign every single example to a broad category. I don't start with a predefined list of categories. That's going to evolve as I am reading the examples. But what that does is it just lets me group together similar examples. And we'll come back to why that's important in a minute. The final three columns are there to help me with organization. I've got a link to the specific example so that I don't need to go hunting for it in the future. And then I've got the dates that I've accessed this material. I'll need to include those in a reference if I ever write this up in a journal article. Obviously, this takes a little bit more work than just starting to highlight examples on the screen and seeing what you get, but hopefully you can see why this might be helpful in the long term. And this is the final thing, over 100 examples catalogued into easily filterable columns. You might notice that I've added an extra column. That's because one of the categories that I came up with I called historical reference. That was used to record examples where a politician used a reference to Alexander to speak for or against a particular policy. That was a really helpful category, but it was starting to get a little bit too broad. So I added this extra column so that I can filter things into smaller groups. Now we've got our table, we can start to build historical arguments. But one isolated example really doesn't tell historians very much at all. Instead, what we're looking for is patterns, and that's where a table like this can be really, really helpful. To show you how this works, I've filtered my category column for the term historical reference, and you can see that that's given me 67 results covering a broad range of different issues. I'm now going to filter the subtypes column for sexuality. This shows you really quickly that Alexander's name has come up twice when politicians have been talking about sexuality. Let's look at those examples. In 1981, as part of a debate about whether homosexuals should be allowed to serve in the British Army, Bruce George said, "May I say that it was perhaps fortunate for Greece and indeed for civilization as a whole that Alexander the Great was not subject to British forces discipline, or he would have been slung out of his army." He's deliberately being a little bit flippant here, and he makes lots of considered points elsewhere, but he brings up Alexander as part of the rhetorical close to his argument, and he says, "I do not think that a person's sexuality would have any impact upon his ability within the armed forces. Alexander's famous conquests are proof of this." Alexander's sexuality was used in a similar way in 2000 by Lord Walton as part of a debate about equalising the age of consent for heterosexual and homosexual sex, which essentially meant lowering the age of consent for anal sex from 18 to 16. Lord Walton said, "Homosexuality has been a fact of life throughout the centuries. We need only look back to see that many notables in history, such as Alexander the Great, and indeed an enormous number of distinguished people in public life, actors, politicians, scientists and others, have openly confessed to their homosexuality." Here he's using Alexander to show that homosexuality is, in his words, a fact of life, and he goes on to say that there is evidence that suggests that sexuality is determined by genetics. In both of these instances, Alexander is being used as an example of a famous man who is understood to have had sex with other men. Now that is something that I think is true. But as an ancient historian, I would stress that the concept of homosexuality would really have had no meaning at all to Alexander or his peers. Ancient ideas about sexuality are being simplified to suit the purposes of the two speakers and the context in which they were speaking. So these two examples show that Alexander has been used by politicians to challenge laws which penalised and restricted homosexual activity in the UK. But two references in a couple of hundred years really aren't enough to establish a pattern as such. So now I want to show you an example of a topic where Alexander has figured a little bit more prominently. One thing that came up several times in the course of my research was the idea that Alexander was a model for good governance. You can see that the earliest example of this came in 1823 and the most recent was in 2013. Overall, I've got 8 examples, and that means I can say that this is indeed a trend. Let's have a look at some of the examples. The first 4 all relate to how Britain should govern India, and that's really not surprising because when the British conquered India, they were very conscious that they were following in the footsteps of Alexander the Great. They often wrote about this, and remember they had of course been brought up on stories of Alexander's conquests in India. We see a really good example of this in a debate from 1858. This was a really pivotal year for the British in India. In 1857, there had been serious military unrest in India, Depending on your perspective, you might call this a mutiny, a rebellion, or perhaps a war of independence. Up until this point, the British had governed India through a private company, the East India Company. But now, in 1858, an Act of Parliament was passed which gave the British government direct control. During one of the debates about this, the MP James Whiteside brought up Alexander. He claimed that before embarking on his invasion of the Persian Empire, Alexander had discussed ideas of governance with his teacher Aristotle. Aristotle had told Alexander to impose Greek laws on the people he conquered, but Alexander disagreed. According to Whiteside, Alexander told Aristotle if India were gained by force of arms, the next step was to establish a government which would be acceptable to the people of the country. In fact, they must be governed but not coerced. This, Whiteside said, contained a sound principle of government, and he went on to say that English rule of India had been more just and more beneficent than any rule to which the people of India had been subjected. What he's doing there is holding up Alexander as an example of good governance and suggesting that the British have followed his lead. Both empires are founded on consent rather than force. But that whole anecdote is entirely invented. We know that Alexander was taught by Aristotle, but none of the ancient sources for his life refer to this conversation. I'm not necessarily saying that Whiteside has made this up himself. I reckon he was probably repeating a story that was commonly told at the time, but I'm honestly not entirely sure where this story comes from. So Whiteside is trying to support his argument by referring to a historical precedent, but the historical precedent he turns to never actually happened. But this idea that Alexander governed by consent is something that later parliamentarians came back to. In 1980, the Earl of Onslow said that Alexander realised his empire would not survive without the consent of the conquered, and so he kept most of the old Persian satraps in office. Now, it is true that after he had defeated the Persians militarily, Alexander allowed some of the Persian governors to remain in office if they defected to him, but not for long. When he returned from India, most of the Persian governors were removed from their positions and several of them were actually executed. I actually did a video about one of them, Auxenes, a few weeks ago, so I'll put a link to that at the end of this video if you want to find out more about this period in Alexander's reign. But what this means is that when Alexander died, there were very few Persians in significant positions of power in his empire. So Onslow's interpretation, yes, it is grounded in some historical fact, but it's too simplistic and ultimately is a deeply flawed vision of Alexander's model of governance. For me, the most interesting example of this category comes from a 1962 debate in the House of Lords about racial discrimination. Lord Milverton said that Alexander, in a famous proclamation, advocated the acceptance of the idea of human equality. And from Alexander the Great, down through the centuries to the French Revolution and the American Declaration of Independence, this ideal has been proclaimed and never realised. It has not yet been achieved. The reason I find this example so interesting is that I think I can tell you exactly where Milverton got this idea. I think it's from a biography of Alexander written by William Woodthorpe Tarn. Tarn wrote that Alexander inspired Zeno's vision of a world in which all men should be citizens of one state, without distinction of race or institutions, and united in one's social life not by compulsion, but only by their own willing consent. Tarn goes on to say that Alexander inspired a line of thinking that ran through the Stoics and one portion of the Christian ideal to that brotherhood of all men which was proclaimed, though only proclaimed, in the French Revolution. And then, in a footnote, he comments that we are moving in a world not realised. The examples that Milverton uses and the way he repeats key words like proclaimed and realised suggests to me that he was drawing directly on Tarn's work. But what makes this example fascinating to me is that Tarn's work was published in 1948, but by the time that Lord Milverton was speaking in the House of Lords, Tarn's argument had been completely and utterly destroyed by another scholar. And I did a video on that debate a little while ago, and I'll link that at the end of the video as well. So even when you have a politician who seems to be trying to draw directly on published historical research, it doesn't necessarily mean that they have a full grasp of the historical issues that they're talking about, because historical consensuses can change quite quickly, and that can leave a politician's understanding of the past looking outdated. What this shows us is that interpretations of the past aren't static, and a politician can have a very different view from a historian. I've saved the best example of this for last. In 2020, Jacob Rees-Mogg told the House of Commons that Our current Prime Minister is a great cutter of Gordian knots, and where there is administrative inefficiency, the Alexander the Great of our time will be cutting these Gordian knots. Later that year, William Cash declared, "Our Prime Minister, a great classicist, is, like his hero Pericles, the first citizen of his country, and like him has saved our democracy. Like Alexander the Great, Boris has cut the Gordian knot." In both of these examples, politicians were comparing Boris Johnson, then the Prime Minister, to Alexander. What they meant here was that Johnson had cut administrative red tape to get the job done. Now, Rees-Mogg and Cash were both Conservative politicians, so we can assume that they meant this comparison with Alexander to be a flattering one. But is it? Gordian is a famous ancient city in what is now modern-day Turkey. The story goes that when Alexander got there, he discovered an old wagon that was tied up with a particularly complex knot. The prophecy went that whoever could untie this knot was destined to become the ruler of all of Asia. Arrian and Plutarch, the two ancient sources that tell us this, give two versions of what happened next. In the first, Alexander couldn't work out how to untie the knot. He was worried that this would look like a bad omen, so he pulled out his sword and cut through the knot. And then he turned to the crowd and said, "Hey, look, I have now untied the knot and I fulfilled the prophecy." But in the second version, Alexander successfully unties the knot. Crucially, both Arrian and Plutarch specifically attribute this story to a guy called Aristobulus. He had served in Alexander's army, had written an account of Alexander's campaign, but he had often tried to defend Alexander's reputation. The fact that it's Aristobulus who gives this version of events is really significant because it suggests that one of Alexander's main supporters thought that the story of Alexander cutting through the knot with his sword was a bad look. And let's be honest, Alexander doesn't come out of that version of events particularly well. He has failed to do what he was supposed to do. He couldn't untie the knot, he lost his temper, and he cut through it with the sword, taking a violent shortcut to solve the problem. Now, that's probably not an image of Boris Johnson that Rees-Mogg and Cash were hoping to create. But there's more to this story than just two politicians misunderstanding the nuance of ancient sources. You can see in my table that I've got 5 instances of people referring to Alexander the Great in the context of talking about the Gordian knot. In every single one of those examples, the Gordian knot was being used as a metaphor for resolving a seemingly impossible or difficult problem. That surprised me and it got me thinking. So I just went into Hansard again and I searched for the Gordian knot. And you can see that I got hundreds and hundreds of results. Now, I haven't looked at these systematically yet and I haven't gone through all of them. I've actually done the thing I told you at the start of the video not to do. I've just opened a few examples to see what was there. All of the ones that I've looked at so far were using the Gordian knot in the same way. So while Rees-Mogg and Cash were making an explicit comparison between Boris Johnson and Alexander the Great, they were drawing on the parliamentary use of the concept of the Gordian knot rather than its actual historical associations. What that shows us is that the Gordian knot, the story of the Gordian knot, has taken on its own meaning and a life of its own in Parliament, which is entirely divorced from its actual historical context. As I've said, this is entirely new research for me. So far, I've spent about a week looking at the evidence and I've asked a really broad question. And obviously that just isn't enough to be proper historical research. So I thought I'd finish the video by just sharing with you the steps I need to take if I want to push this project further, because these are the kind of steps you would need to take to refine your own research projects. First of all, I need to broaden my search terms. So far, I've only looked at examples of people actually saying the words Alexander the Great, but people might have referred to Alexander in different ways, as Alexander the son of Philip or Alexander the Macedonian, for instance. If I want to do a really serious study of how Alexander has been represented in Parliament, I need to find every single mention of him, and that is going to be a huge amount of work. Secondly, I need to start refining my research questions. Rather than just asking this really big question, I need to break things down and think about it from different angles. For example, I've now got a list of politicians who have mentioned Alexander in Parliament. I could go away and do some research into their background. I might be able to find out, for instance, whether people who had studied classics at school or university are more likely to mention Alexander than those who had not. If that's the case, it might give me some insight into how different demographic or socioeconomic groups have engaged with Alexander's legacy. Alternatively, I could look in lots more detail at the apparent fixation on the Gordian knot. Obviously, those are very different avenues of approach, and that's because while we always start out with a question we want to answer, Good historians will adapt that question in light of the evidence that they find. If I can give you a terrible analogy, it's like gold mining. You might start out with a general area to explore, but as soon as you find that first piece of gold, you're going to follow the seam all the way down, and that might take you quite a long way from your starting point. But as long as you're getting gold, and by gold I mean interesting historical insight, then that is fine. Speaking of historical insight, the third and most important thing I need to do now is work out whether any of the stuff that I've said in this video actually matters. I certainly think it's interesting, and if you've stuck with me through this video, thank you for sticking with me first of all, but also hopefully that suggests that you think it's interesting too. But for historical research to matter, it needs to be more than that. I need to decide whether there's anything here which fundamentally changes the way we understand the reception of Alexander the Great, and which would add to historians' knowledge of the past. If not, for all that I think that this is a really interesting topic, it probably isn't worth me spending potentially years of my life on this project. And that's a really important question that historians have to grapple with all of the time. What's worth doing and what isn't worth doing? So yeah, let me know in the comments if you think this is worth me exploring in more detail. Thanks for watching the video. Please do give it a like if you've enjoyed it, if you found anything useful there for your own research. I'll be back with another deep dive soon, and yeah, I'll keep you posted on what I decide to do with this project.